Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Insurgent Mexico. We're getting through there. But yeah, today we will be getting in with the Gates of Gomez, and hopefully we can get through. It'll be three chapters I'm wanting to finish up today. But anyway, let's go ahead and just jump into this, shall we? Chapter 5, the gates of at the gates of Gomez. We had taken Bermejillo the afternoon before, the army breaking into a furious gallop 5 kilometers north of the town and pouring through it at top speed, driving the unprepared garrison in a route southward. A running fight that lasted 5 miles as far as the hacienda of Santa Clara, and killing 106 Colorados. Within a few hours afterward, Urbina came in sight above Mapimi, and the 800 Colorados there, informed of the astonishing news that the entire Constitutionalist army was flanking them on their right, evacuated the place and fled hotly to Torreon. All over the country, the astounded Federals were falling back in a panic upon the city. Late in the afternoon, a dumpy little train came down the narrow gauge track from the direction of Mapimi, and from it proceeded the loud strains of a string orchestra of 10 pieces, playing Recuerdos of Durango, to which I had so often ballet with the troopa. The roofs, doors, and windows were packed with Mexicans singing and beating time with their heels as they fired their rifles in a sort of salute upon entering the town. At the station, the curious equipage drew up, and from it proceeded who but Patricio, General Urbina's fighting stage driver, at whose side I had often ridden and danced. He threw his arms around me, yelling, "Juanito! Here is Juanito, mi general!" In a minute, we were asking and answering each other a million questions. Did I have the photographs I took of him? Was I going to the Battle of Torreon? Did he know where Don Petronilo was? And Pablo Seafes? And Rafaelito? And right in the midst of it, somebody shouted, "Viva Urbina!" And the old general himself stood at the top of the steps, the lion-hearted hero of Durango. He was lame and leaned upon 2 soldiers. He held a rifle in his hand, an old discarded Springfield, with the sights filed down, and wore a double cartridge belt around his waist. For a moment he remained there absolutely expressionless, his small, hard eyes boring into me. I thought he did not recognize me. Then all at once his harsh, sudden voice shot out, "That's not the camera you had. Where's the other one?" I was about to reply when he interrupted. "I know. You left it behind you in La Cadena. Did you run very fast?" "Yes, mi general." "And you've come down to Torreon to run again?" When I began to run from La Cadena, I remarked, nettled, Don Petronillo and the troops were already a mile away. He didn't answer, but he came haltingly down the steps of the car while a roar of laughter went up from the soldiers. Coming up to me, he put a hand over my shoulder and gave me a little tap on the back. "I'm glad to see you, compañero," he said. Across the street, the wounded had begun to straggle in from the Battle of Tlahualilo to the hospital train, which lay far up near the front of the line of trains. On the flat, barren plain, as far as I could see it, there were only 3 living things in sight. A limping, hatless man with his head tied up in a bloody cloth, another staggering beside him, his staggering horse, and a mule mounted by 2 bandaged figures far behind him. And in the still hot night, we could hear from our car groans and screams. Late Sunday morning, we were again on El Nino, at the head of the repair train, moving slowly down the track abreast of the army. El Chavalito, another cannon mounted on a flat car, was coupled behind. Then came 2 more armored cars and the work cars. This time there were no women. The army wore a different air, winding along in 2 immense serpents each side of us. There was little laughter or shouting. We were close now, only 15 miles from Gomez Palacio, and no one knew that what the Federals planned to do. It seemed incredible that they would let us get so close without making one stand. Immediately south of Bermejillo, we entered a new land. To the desert succeeded fields bordered with irrigation ditches, along which grew immense green alamos, towering pillars of freshness after the baked desolation we had just passed through. Here were cotton fields, the white tufts unpicked and rotting on their stalks, cornfields with sparse green blades just showing. Along the big ditches flowed swift, deep water in the shade. Birds sang in the barren western mountains marched steadily near as we went south. It was summer, hot, moist summer, such as we have at home. A deserted cotton gin lay on our left. Hundreds of white bells tumbled in the sun, and dazzling heaps of cotton seed left just as the workmen had piled it months before. At Santa Clara, the massed columns of the army halted and began to defile to left and right. Thin lines of troops jogging out under the checkered sun and shade of the great trees, until 6,000 men were spread in one long single front, to the right over fields and to the right over fields and through ditches beyond the last cultivated field. Across the desert, to the very base of the mountains, to the left, over the row of the flat world. The bugles blared faintly and near, and the army moved forward in a mighty line across the whole country. Above them lifted a 5-mile wide golden dust glory. Flags flapped. In the center, level with them, came the cannon car, and beside that, Villa rode with his staff. At the little villages along the way, the big-hatted white bloused Pacificos stood in silent wonder, watching this strange host pass. An old man drove his goats homeward. The foaming wave of troopers broke upon him, yelling with pure mischief, and all the goats ran in different directions. A mile of army shouted with laughter. The dust rode up from their 1,000 hoofs, and they passed. At the village of Brittingham, the great line halted, while Villa and his staff galloped up to the peons, watching from their little mound. "Oh yes," said Villa. "Have any troops passed through here lately?" "No, senor," answered several men at once. "Some of Don Carlo Argumedo's gente went by yesterday pretty fast." Villa meditated. "Have you seen that bandit Pancho Villa around here?" "No, senor," they chorused. "Well, he's a fellow I'm looking for. If I catch that Diablo, it will go hard with him." "We wish you all success," cried the Pacificos politely. "You never saw him, did you?" "No, God forbid," they said fervently. "Well," grinned Villa, "in the future when people ask you if you know him, you will have to admit the shameful fact. I am Pancho Villa." And with that he spurred away, and all the army followed. Chapter 6. The Compañeros reappear. Such had been the surprise of the Federals, and they had fled in such a hurry, that for many miles the railroad was intact. But toward afternoon they began to find little bridges burned and still smoking, and telegraph poles cut down with an axe, badly and hastily done bits of destruction that were easily repaired. But the army had got far ahead, and by nightfall, about 8 miles from Gomez Palacio, they reached the palace where 8 solid miles of torn-up track began. There was no food on our train. We had only a blanket apiece, and it was cold. In the flare of the torches and fires, the repair gang fell upon their work. Shouts and hammering steel and the thud of falling ties. It was a black night with a few dim stars. We had settled down around one fire, talking and drowsing, when suddenly a new sound smote the air, a sound heavier than hammers and deeper than the wind. It shocked, and it was still. Then came a steady roll, as of distant drums, and then shock, shock. The hammers fell, voices were silent. We were frozen. Somewhere ahead, out of sight in the darkness, so still it was that the air carried every sound. Villa and the army had flung themselves upon Gomez Palacio, and the battle had begun. It deepened steadily and slowly until the booms of the cannon fell echoing upon each other, and the rifle fire rippled like still rain. "Andale!" screamed a hoarse voice from the roof of the cannon car. "What are you doing? Get at that track! Pancho Villa is waiting for the trains!" And with a yell, 400 raging maniacs flung themselves upon the brake. I remember how we besought the colonel in command to let us go to the front. He would not. Orders were strict that no one should leave the trains. We pled with him, offered him money, almost got on our knees to him. Finally, he relented a little. At 3 o'clock, he said, I'll give you the sign and countersign and let you go. We curled miserably about a little fire of our own, trying to sleep, trying to at least get warm around us, and ahead the flares and the men danced along the ruined track, and every hour or so the train would creep forward 100 feet and stop again. It was not hard to repair. The rails were intact. A wrecker had been hitched to the right-hand rail, and the ties twisted, splintered, torn from their bed. Always the monotonous and disturbing, furious sound of battle filtered out of the blackness ahead. It was so tiresome, so much the same, that sound, and yet I could not sleep. About midnight, one of our outposts galloped from the rear of the trains to report that a large body of horsemen had been challenged coming from the north, who said they were Urbina's gente from Mapimi. The colonel didn't know of any body of troops that were to pass at that time of the night. In a minute, everything was a fury of preparation. 25 armed and mounted men galloped like mad to the rear, with orders to stop the newcomers for 15 minutes if they were constitutionalists, by order of the colonel. If not, by holding them off as long as possible. The workmen were hurried back to the train and given their rifles. The fires were put out, the flares, all but 10, extinguished. Our guard of 200 slipped silently into the thick brush, loading their rifles as they went. On either side of the track, the colonel and 5 of his men took up their posts, unarmed, with torches held high over their heads. And then, out of the thick blackness, the head of the column appeared. It was made up of different men from the well-clothed, well-equipped, well-fed soldiers of Villa's army. These were ragged, gaunt people, wrapped in faded, tattered scrapes, without shoes on their feet, crowned with the heavy, picturesque sombreros of the back country. Lasso ropes hung coiled at their saddles. Their mounts were the lean, hard, half-savage ponies of the Durango Mountains. They rode sullenly, contemptuous of us, and neither knew the countersign nor cared to know it. And as they rode, whole files sang the monotonous extemporaneous ballads that the peons compose and sing to themselves as they guard the cattle at night on the great upland plains of the north. And suddenly, as I stood at the head of the line of flares, a passing horse was jerked to his haunches, and a voice I knew cried, "Hey, meester!" The enfolding serape was cast high in the air, and a man fell from his horse, and in a moment I was clasped in the arms of Isidro Amaya. Behind him burst forth a chorus of shouts. "Que tal, mister? Oh, Juanito, I'm glad we are to see you. Where have you been? They said you were killed in La Cadena. Did you run fast from the Colorados? Mucho susto, eh?" They threw themselves to the ground, clustering around, 50 men reaching at once to pat me on the back. All my dearest friends in Mexico, the compañeros of La Tropa and the Cadena. The long file of men blocked in the darkness raised a chorus of shouts. "Move on! Vámonos! What's the matter? "Hurry up! We can't stay here all night," and the others yelled back, "Here's Meester! Here's the gringo we were telling you about who danced the jota in La Zarca, who was in La Cadena." And then the others crowded forward too. There were 1,200 of them, silently, sullenly, eagerly sniffing the battle ahead. They defiled between the double line of high-held torches, and every 10th man I had known before. As they passed, the colonel shouted to them, "What is the countersign? Turn your hats up in front. Do you know the countersign?" Hoarsely, exasperatedly, he bawled at them. Serenely and insolently they rode by, without paying the least attention to him. "To hell with the countersign," they hooted, laughing at him. "We don't need any countersign. They'll know well enough which side we're on when we begin to fight." For hours, it seemed, they jogged past, fading into the darkness. Their horses with nervous heads turned to catch the sound of guns, and men with glowing eyes, fixed on the darkness ahead, rode into battle with their ancient Springfield rifles that had been serviced for 3 years, with their meager 10 rounds of ammunition. And then they had all gone to the battle, seemed to brighten and quicken with new life. Chapter 7. The Bloody Dawn. The steady noise of the battle filled all the night. Ahead, torches danced, rails clanged, sledges drummed on the spikes. The men of the repair gang shouted in the frenzy of their toil. It was after 12, since the trains had reached the beginning of the torn track we had made half a mile. Now and then a straggler from the main body came down the line of trains, shuffled into the light with his heavy Mauser awry across his shoulders, and faded into the darkness toward the debauch of sound in the direction of Gomez Palacio. The soldiers of our guard, squatting about their little fires in the fields, relaxed their tense expectancy. 3 of them were singing a little marching song which began, "I don't want to be a porfirista. I don't want to be an Orozquista, but I want to be a volunteer in the army Maderista." Curious and excited, we hurried up and down the trains, asking people what they knew, what they thought. I had never heard a real killing sound before, and it made me frantic with curiosity and nervousness. We were like dogs in a yard when a dogfight is going on outside. Finally, the spell snapped, and I found myself desperately tired. I fell into a dead sleep on a little ledge under the lip of the cannon, where the laborers tossed their wrenches and sledgehammers and crowbars when the train moved forward 100 feet and piled on themselves with shouts and horseplay. In the coldness of before dawn, I woke with the colonel's hand on my shoulder. "You can go now," he said. "The sign is Zaragoza and the countersign Guerrero. Our soldiers will be recognized by their hats pinned up in front. May you go well." It was bitter cold. We threw our blankets around us, serape fashion, and trudged down past the fury of repair gang as they hammered at it under the leaping flares, and past the 5 armed men slouching around their fire on the frontier of the dark. "Are you off to the battle, compañeros?" cried one of the gang. Look out for the bullets. At that, they all laughed. The sentries cried, Adios! Don't kill 'em all! Leave a few pelones for us. Beyond the last torch, where the torn track was wrenched and tumbled about on the uprooted roadbed, a shadowy figure waited for us. Vamonos, together, he said, peering at us. In the dark, three are an army. He stumbled along over the broken track silently, just able to make him out with our eyes. He was a little dumpy soldier with a rifle and a half-empty cartridge belt over his breast. He said that he had just brought a wounded man from the front to the hospital train and was on his way back. Feel this, he said, holding out his arm. It was drenched. We could see nothing. Blood? He continued unemotionally. His blood. He was my compadre in the Brigada Gonzales Ortega. We went in this night down there, and so many. We were cut in half. It was the first we had heard or thought of wounded men. All of a sudden we heard the battle. It had been going on steadily all the time, but we had forgotten. The sound was so monstrous, so monotonous. Far rifle fire came like the ripping of strong canvas. The cannon shot like pile drivers. We were only 6 miles away now. Out of the darkness loomed a little knot of men, 4 of them carrying something heavy and an inert in a blanket slung between. Our guide threw up his rifle and challenged, and his answer was a retching groan from the blanket. Oiga, compadre, lisped one of the bears huskily. Where, for the love of the Virgin, is the hospital train? About a league. Valgame Dios. How can we... Water? Have you any water? They stood with the blanket top between them, and something fell from it. Drip, drip, drip on the ties. That awful voice within screamed once, "To drink!" and fell away to a shuddering moan. We handed our canteens to the bears, and silently, bestially, they drained them. The wounded man they forgot. Then sullen they pitched on. Others appeared, singly or in little groups. They were simply vague shapes, staggering in the night, like drunkards, like men incredibly tired. One dragged between 2 walkers, his arms around their shoulders. A mere boy reeled along with his limp body of his father on his back. A horse passed with his nose to the ground, 2 bodies flopping sideways across the saddle, and a man walking behind and beating the horses on the rump, cursing shrilly. He passed, and we could hear his falsetto fading dissonantly in the distance. Some groaned with the ugly, deadened groan of uttermost pain. One man slouched in the saddle of a mule, screamed mechanically every time the mule took a step. Under 2 tall cottonwood trees, beside an irrigation ditch, a little fire glowed. 3 sleepers with empty cartridge belts sprawled snoring on the uneven ground. Beside the fire sat a man holding with both hands his legs straight out to the warmth. It was a perfectly good leg as far as the ankle. There it ended in a ragged, oozing mess of trousers and shattered flesh. The man simply sat looking at it. He didn't even stir as we came near, and yet his chest rose and fell with calm breathing, and his mouth was silently open as if he were daydreaming. By the side of the ditch kneeled another. A soft lead bullet had entered his hand before the two middle fingers, and then spread until it hollowed out a bloody cave inside. He had wrapped a rag around a little piece of stick and was unconcernedly dipping it in the water and gouging out the wound. Soon we were near the battle. In the east, across the vast level country, a faint gray light appeared. The noble alamo trees, towering thickly in massy lines along the ditches to the west, burst into showers of birdsong. It was getting warm, and there came the tranquil smell of earth and grass and growing corn, a calm summer dawn. Into this the noise of battle broke like something insane. The hysterical chatter of rifle fire that seemed to carry a continuous undertone of screaming, although when you listened for it, it was gone. The nervous, deadly stab, 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 stab of the machine guns, like some gigantic woodpecker. The cannon booming like great bells, and the whistle of their shells. Boom! And then the most terrible of all the sounds of war, shrapnel exploding. Crash! The great hot sun swam up the east through a fainting smoke from the fertile land, and over the eastern barrens the heat waves began to wriggle. It caught the startlingly green tops of the lofty alamos fringing the ditch that paralleled the railroad on our right. The trees ended there, and beyond the whole rampart of bare mountains piled range on range grew rosy. We were now in scorched desert again, thickly covered with dusty mesquite. Except for another line of alamos straggling across from east to west, close to the city, there were no trees in all the plain but 2 or 3 scattered ones to the right. So close we were, barely 2 miles from Gomez Palacio, that we could look down the torn track right into the town. We could see the black round water tank, and the back of that, the round house. And across the track from them both, the low adobe walls of the Brittenham Corral. The smokestacks and buildings of the trees of La Esperanza soap factory rose clear and still like a little city to the left, almost directly to the right of the railroad track. It seemed the stark stony peak of the Cerro de la Pila mounted steeply to the stone reservoir that crowned it, and sloped off westward in a series of smaller peaks, a spiny ridge a mile long. Most of Gomez lay behind the shoulder of the Cerro, and at its western end the villas and gardens of Lerdo made a vivid patch of green in the desert. The great brown mountains on the west made a mighty sweep around behind the two cities, and then fell away south again in folds on folds of gaunt desolation. And directly south from Gomez, stretched along the base of this range, lay Torreon, the richest city of northern Mexico. The shooting never ceased, but it seemed to be subdued to a subordinate place in a fantastic and disordered world. Up the track in the hot morning light straggled a river of wounded men, shattered, bleeding, bound up in rotting and bloody bandages, inconceivably weary. They passed us, and one even fell and lay motionless nearby in the dust, and we didn't care. Soldiers with their cartridges gone wandered aimlessly out of the chaparral, dragging their rifles, and plunged into the brush again on the other side of the railroad, black with powder, streaked with sweat, their eyes vacantly on the ground. The thin, subtle dust rose in lazy clouds at every footstep and hung there, parching throats and eyes. A little company of horsemen jogged out of the thicket and drew up on the track, looking toward town. One man got down from his saddle and squatted beside us. "It was terrible," he said suddenly. "Caramba! They went in there last night on foot. They were inside the water tank with holes cut in the iron for rifles. We had to walk up and poke our guns through the hose, and we killed them all. A death trap. And then the corral, they had two sets of loopholes, one for the men kneeling down and the other for the men standing up. 3,000 rurales in there, and they had 5 machine guns to sweep the road. And the roundhouse, with 3 rows of trenches outside and subterranean passages, so they could crawl under and shoot us in the back. Our bombs wouldn't work, and what could we do with rifles? Madre de Dios! But we were quick. We took them by surprise. We captured the roundhouse and the water tank, and then this morning thousands came. Thousands. Reinforcements from Torreon and their artillery, and they drove us back again. They walked up to the water tank and poked their rifles through the hose and killed all of us, the sons of the devils. We could see the place as he spoke and hear the hellish roar and shriek, and yet no one moved, and there wasn't a sign of the shooting, not even smoke, except when a shrapnel shell burst yelling down in the first row of trees a mile ahead and vomited a puff of white. The cracking rip of rifle fire and the staccato machine guns and even the hammering cannon didn't reveal themselves at all. The flat, dusty plain, the trees and chimneys of Gomez, and the stony hill lay quietly in the heat. From the Alamos off to the right came the careless song of birds. One had the impression that his senses were lying. It was an incredible dream through which the grotesque procession of wounded filtered like ghosts in the dust. But that will end that episode. We'll get a direct look at traveling on the railroad cars, meeting old friends, and making their way to the battleground at Gomez Palacio. It may be Palacio, but I think it's Palacio. Anyway. Yeah. I love the little rhyme. I don't want to be a Ortizista or an Orosista. But thank God for the Maderista. Porfirista, sorry. Don't want to be a Porfirista. Don't want to be an Orosquista. So I want to be a volunteer, but I want to be a volunteer in the army of Maderista. Now remember, Porfirio is or Porfirista is a reference to the original president of Mexico in the 1800s when this whole situation that led up to the Revolutionary War happened. So yeah. And then Orozquista is a reference to Pascual Orozco. And he wants nothing to do with either side. And these Porfirioista were usually your wealthy and corrupt. And then Orozquista was usually working for the federals, the federales, if you will. But yeah. And then we've talked a lot about Maderista, who was more the president of the people. But yeah. Anyway, we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.